Dear friends, ever since the beginning in 2008, the Oslo Freedom Forum has given brave women and men who fight for human rights a platform to share their stories. On this podium, very brave and courageous women and men from North Korea to the Middle East have told their inspiring and often very dramatic stories of how one individual can stand up to an authoritarian regime, of how to fight injustice, and how just one individual can make all the difference. Oslo Freedom Forum has developed, it has expanded from an annual conference here in Oslo to more or less a global community with regional events in the US, Latin America, and most recently in South Africa. It's very good to be back here again, and the government is very proud to be collaborating with the Oslo Freedom Forum, actually since the beginning. So it is also my pleasure to say today, happy 10th anniversary. 2018 marks an anniversary year for human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights turns 70. The UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders turns 20. And it is also 25 years since the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was established. This actually provides us with an opportunity to reflect on our achievements, but also the challenges ahead. For Norway, this also embodies a very clear ambition to intensify our efforts to protect and promote human rights worldwide. Human rights are now an integral part of all governments' obligations towards their citizens through international conventions that have been developed and ratified over the past 70 years. Women's political representation has increased significantly. We have better and also quicker access to information than the generation before us. Human rights, peace and security, and development, as reflected in the 3 pillars of the UN system, are without a doubt mutually reinforcing. Democracy and the respect for human rights are essential to peace and stability, both within and between states. But at an even more fundamental level, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law gives women and men the freedom to choose and the freedom to create their own lives. Human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, they are closely linked. Respect for human rights is crucial to democracy. But at the same time, human rights are merely empty words without institutions to enforce them. An independent judiciary is important to uphold and to properly protect these rights. And this is why robust institutions and checks and balances are so vital. For a long time, we assumed that once democracy had arrived, it was here to stay. But we have witnessed that even in established democracies, we can have setbacks. And we cannot take a vibrant democracy for granted. We're living in a time where liberal democracy, established institutions, and the international world order are all under pressure. Extremism, violent conflict, authoritarian regimes, and growing polarizations are real threats to countries and in countries throughout the world. In some countries, we also see democratic institutions and processes that are being used to undermine the very same principles of democratic institutions. We see a shrinking space for freedom of expression, for independent media, for civil society in many countries. The right to peaceful protest is very often clamped down upon. Attacks on the press can often be considered a warning sign of democratic backsliding. According to Reporters Without Borders, freedom of the press is threatened or in a very serious situation in 70 countries. I'm deeply concerned about the negative trends in the working conditions for journalists and the growing number of threats and attacks, including in a number of established democracies. In many parts of the world, human rights defenders are at great risk. Of course, this is unacceptable. And some of you present here today represent and experience this firsthand. I really commend your bravery. Your courage to continue working inspires us, but it also urges us to keep up our efforts for human rights. As governments, we should not curtail universal rights and fundamental freedoms. Rather, the authorities at all levels have an obligation to create a safe, enabling environment for the defense of these rights and these freedoms. It's the duty of all states to protect journalists, to protect human rights defenders, and to fight impunity for attacks and killings. The Global State of Democracy report issued by the International IDEA has one interesting observation. Democratic backsliding does not indicate a decline in popular support for democracy, but the opposite. That gives hope. Over the past 70 years, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has actually taught us all to demand our rights, to which we are all entitled. Authorities have at times tried to undermine these rights, but yet they are powers for every human being, regardless of differences, and that power has endured. Part of the success for the democratic development has been the expansion of human rights institutions and regional organizations, as well as the continued enhancement of human rights standards and instruments. Governments have actually accepted new obligations and new duties to adhere to. But perhaps more importantly, the structures have continued to spread knowledge to citizens about their rights, and by that, enabling citizens to speak up and to make decisions about their own lives. The human rights conventions and instruments are the bar that we measure our performance against. And an important point is that our bar today is raised higher than 70 years ago, higher than 20 years ago, higher than even 10 years ago. While we experience pressure against human rights and liberal values, there is also a growing awareness at what is at stake. What democratic principles and rule of law actually entails. What the consequences are when rights are undermined gradually or overnight. In many democracies, there is a mobilization of new group of actors, including young people, demanding that their voices are listened to and that their rights and freedoms are respected. The bar is set at an even higher level in 2018. But this is also thanks to extensive and crucial effort by civil society to document human rights violations and to advocate for change. Small countries like Norway depend on the broad multilateral frameworks. But the multilateral framework is not just a network of organizations, institutions, countries. It's a community of shared values. A community of values such as democracy, individual freedoms, and the rule of law. In multilateral fora, such as the Human Rights Council, cross-regional cooperation is the rule rather than the exception. We share priorities, values, and ideas with many countries, also beyond our traditional like-minded groups. And this opens for new initiatives and new possibilities. we can do more to promote and protect human rights. Oslo Freedom Forum is also a platform that so evidently contributes to this. Norway also strongly believes that there is a need to focus more on addressing situations before they escalate. And we must increase the resources available for doing so. So strengthening the human rights pillar in the UN system is an important investment, not only in human rights, but also in development and peace and security. That is why, in February, I signed a 4-year agreement with the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, substantially increasing our funding, but also having a long-term perspective. There can be no democracy without a diverse civil society, without freedom of assembly, without a free press. And civil society has an important role to play in holding governments to account. Human rights defenders work to make our societies better. Last autumn, Norway led the work when the General Assembly adopted a strong and unanimous resolution that recognizes the role and the work of human rights defenders. And that's not a given nowadays. It was a collective achievement. We now rely on all partners in the Oslo Freedom Forum family to engage and to show support for human rights defenders. But we must not forget that we have truly come a long way in 70 years. Today we have international and regional frameworks of declarations and conventions, and we have an international civil society and organizations that work to actually defend and promote human rights. But we also face challenges. So, friends, this is not the time to rest. We must continue to fight the good fight for human rights. We must strive towards closing the gap between agreed norms and realities on the ground. And here, Oslo Freedom Forum, of course, plays a role. Because when we hear the brave stories on this podium, we are reminded of the very first sentence in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It states, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." But as we know, this principle doesn't always hold true in practice. Too many women, men, and children around the world are daily denied their freedoms, their rights, and their dignity. And as long as this is the case, we must never stop our efforts for the protection and the realization of basic human rights. I'm wishing you all the best for your 10th conference. Thank you very much.